So we're checking back in with our friend. I use the term sardonically, just some guy, a notorious quote black YouTuber who has been gatekeeping the Lord of the Rings fandom for some time, usually with some pretty ugly fascist methods. But surprise, surprise, I do agree with some of his broad points when he's attacking, I guess, this black female queer leftist who wants to insert all these black gay characters in the canon, which don't really exist. So I think broadly speaking, he's correct, even though when he comes to particulars, he kind of messes up what he's saying. But I do agree, she seems a little, frankly, deranged. But given his own confrontation with her, I'm going to keep it very vague. We're just going to call her Inclusion Girl and say that Inclusion Girl does make a few good points, but she also makes a whole lot of bad points. So we're going to start off with a semi-okay point, which I think he misread badly. But don't worry, we'll grant him a strong point soon enough.
If Legolas would have tolerated such open bigotry and discrimination. You're talking about the elf who basically wanted to kill dwarves when he saw him at the council. The elf who literally only liked one dwarf, and even then just barely tolerated going with him to Oglarond. The one who starts off racist against dwarves. Did you read the book? Did you watch the films? He would have been the bigot, dumbass. Right there, that statement shows that Christina is a fake fan. She's not a real Tolkien fan because she doesn't even know anything about the character she mentions. Yes, by the end of the story, Legolas and Gimli change their minds about their respective races, but they both start out pretty bigoted, and this is in the books and the films. You can't miss it unless you weren't paying attention. And just to prove how much Christina is a fake fan, she says, quote, "After learning more about Tolkien and his work, I suspect that Legolas might have encouraged it." You know, you would have noticed that if you read the fucking book. This is why fans can't stand people latching onto fandoms when they get popular, because then you have to deal with people asking and saying things that have already been addressed in the work. But as we'll see, fake fans like Christina.
As you yourself say, yeah, Legolas is kind of styled a bigot. That's what she said, that he would probably be okay with bigotry. I don't think you read that passage very carefully. I understand where you're going with this, but she's technically correct in a certain way, and you're affirming that, so I'm not clear what we're talking about. And to give him some credit, he did use the full passage, even though he only read a part of it. Now, I don't think we want to go too far with the racial allegory with dwarves and elves. As far as I know, Tolkien never affirmed that. But yes, we can get around. He did sometimes use racial stereotypes, mainly positive ones, especially for the Jews and the dwarves. He's very pro-Jewish, but these are technically still racist stereotypes. So we have to handle this issue very carefully because she did do some homework and she brought up some disturbing quotes, which we have to deal with, honestly.
Earth are repeatedly coded as black and shown to be irredeemable. Tolkien explicitly described them in the private letter as squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow skin with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to the Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. Christina, the last time I checked, Mongols are Asian, not African. And you're ignoring the context of the orcs. They're presented as corrupted versions of men and elves, to the point that Tolkien's never clear on how they came about. Within the lore, it's presumed that they may have been created by Morgoth, as his twisted attempt of making a race of men or elves, or that the original orcs or even some of the current ones are corrupted, tortured elves so twisted by Morgoth that they become this sad race. It's also worth mentioning sallow means yellowing or browning of skin, basically a sickly appearance. That means that the orcs could very well look like men and elves, but just look sickly, not brown skinned like the Africans, or literally black skin.
Well, his main point is correct, sort of seeing Mongol as a marker for black or African people doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And his massive point that the orcs are not black, I do agree with. I mean, again, the description is really that they're more yellowish skin, so make of that what you will. But he did kind of sidestep the important issue, which is Tolkien did use Mongol. He did kind of racialize the orcs, but not in the way people think. And that did violate his own rule that he wasn't going to use allegorical language or that he would not use history in a direct way. So there are some problems with this. I think overall Tolkien was a good man. He's very anti-racist. In the majority of instances, he clearly was anti-Nazi, anti-racist, but he did make a few mistakes. He was a flawed man. I mean, he was pro-fascist for a while, so we don't want to cover up the record. I think, again, he is mainly correct that this inclusion girl is being very selective. But again, sometimes she did raise a few good points, and we have to grant that. I do think she misread that whole Mongol passage. I don't know how she did that, but she did. But then she brought up a perfectly legitimate point, which is strong. And again, we are assuming she is not, quote, a full-blown Tolkien fan. She's more of a Peter Jackson person, which, by the way, he is also. So this seems like a bit of a contradiction, especially when we get to the topic she's raising about video game adaptations in particular.
That does not mean the game had to follow suit. Yeah, it does if they were trying to be accurate to the book. It's not debatable. The Eldar are pretty much all described as having fair skin. The darkest they ever seem to get is olive skin, so no darker than a Spaniard or a Greek. They would never even be Sicilian dark. It just doesn't happen anywhere in the text at all. Their hair colors and eye colors give it away. They're clearly Nordic, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon in their descriptions. If you're making a game based on the lore, which is what the fans would want, there would never be dark-skinned elves. It just wouldn't happen. But she says, quote, "This choice, made by the developers and reinforced by the fans, clearly relayed to me that I, and my skin, was not really welcome."
Well, again, I do agree that his case against her is mainly strong, but she raised a very good, legitimate question and point. Be careful, we can abuse this principle, but again, technically speaking, Tolkien simply never answered this question because it wasn't possible. He died before video games even became a thing. Video games do have a long existence. They actually have been with us for quite a while, but as far as I know, he was never really conscious of video games in any real sense. The idea that he even fathomed video game adaptations is simply impossible. So we're in a very tricky area, and he should be honest enough to say that. We don't know how to proceed. Now, to be honest, I have read the books, I have seen the films, and yes, I did play the video games. In fact, I did a video way, way back, which back then got me a pretty respectable views. And I did affirm that I liked the video game. So to maintain consistency, and this is the problem, we would have to say, well, whatever Tolkien's wishes, we have to allow a certain space for adaptations to do their own thing. Him appealing to, well, they still have to remain faithful to what Tolkien wanted, is ridiculous. Tolkien did not want video game adaptations. He sold the film rights, period. That is what he conceived of when he signed that contract. We cannot simply say that he licensed video game adaptations in a direct sense. He did not. Some of these video game adaptations do appear to be pretty good, but do they have anything to do with Tolkien? No. And she just asked a simple question. Well, again, if we're not really basing this on the real lore, why do the elves or other characters have to be white-skinned? And the answer would be, well, that's what it is in the books, is frankly not relevant. As an author, Tolkien never spoke on this issue, period. We are completely blind. We just don't know where to proceed. He's completely silent on this issue. Now, again, this can be abused because just like it is wrong to just make all characters white because the video game technically, they're basically a question mark. We don't really know what we right or wrong, frankly. But I do think making them all white is definitely wrong. But then if you made them all black, that would also be wrong. So I think the problem here is he's basically correct with what he's saying against her, but he's not being consistent. He's just saying, you're so obsessed with race and you want black people everywhere. He's doing the same thing. He just wants white people everywhere in Lord of the Rings, no matter if that's true in the text or what Tolkien wanted. So even if Tolkien spoke out against apartheid and hated racist doctrines, he doesn't care. He's going to use racism against her. He'd say, listen, girl, I'm more black than you. I got more black blood in my body. You only half black. He literally says these things. He actually says these things.
Space. I later learned that this was not an uncommon experience for black fans, especially queer black women, who often feel isolated and silenced in such spaces. Yeah, because your black asses won't shut the fuck up about being queer black women. You're not there to be fans, you're there to criticize, and no real fan wants to put up with that all the time. If you're so focused on trying to tear down a work in its fandom that you feel the need to resist, you don't belong in that fandom and you're not wanted. Nobody wants you around if you're spending all your time looking for these bullshit microaggressions so you can play the victim because you want to be special. And definitely no one's going to put up with you calling them white supremacists because they like Lord of the Rings the way it is and don't want you changing Tolkien's world to suit your racist politics. If that's all you want to do, then like they said, isn't there a black-centered fandom you can be a part of? I know the answer is no because despite all the complaints about the lack of inclusivity and representation, nobody actually wants to make a black version of Lord of the Rings. You're not interested in Afrocentric fantasies, you just want control. And we saw that with how black folks.
He is what he is. He's a racist, he's a Nazi, he's a neo-fascist. But overall, I do think he made a pretty good case against her. So she's mostly on weak grounds. But on the video game issue, yeah, I don't know. I think we'd have to honestly look at that carefully. I don't think we are obligated to follow the books here because the books have nothing to do with this. He has nothing to do with this. But nevertheless, we don't want to abuse that principle. I mean, we don't want to turn Schmaug into a toaster. I think that would not be licensed. But at the same time, would Tolkien be against it? He wouldn't have an answer because he never contemplated these things. Period. It's not clear where we would proceed. Video game adaptations are simply something he never contemplated. Period. So we're kind of in a very murky area, and we should be honest enough to say that. And that is where we are. But it's mostly a bad essay. He is correct. She's not to be trusted. She does seem to be a very crazed leftist queer woman who happens to be black and using her identity. But he's doing the same thing. He's just doing it for right-wing grifting purposes. That we're ending up in the same place that Tolkien is getting lost, unfortunately.